Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify in Rome. That's the word that the Apostle Paul had heard from the Lord that has led Paul all the way to Rome. We finally get there today. Now, Paul's last few years have not been easy. A reminder that Christianity isn't about an easy life, and the kind of deliverance that we receive doesn't mean we'll never experience trials or temptations or hardship or persecution or scorn. Paul, faithful to the Lord's call, has been denied justice. He's been denied fair trial. He's been denied freedom. He's had to choose between assassination or living protected in prison. He's obeyed the Lord's call to go to Rome and accepted the Lord's provision of a route to Rome. And along the way, he's been starved, he's been shipwrecked, and in the first part of today's chapter, bit by a poisonous snake. In terms of pure terror, at least it wasn't a spider, but it feels like it has gone from bad to worse. Yet Paul has made it. He's healthy. He is provided for. He is ready to go to work proclaiming the gospel. So here now the conclusion of the book of Acts, beginning in chapter 28, we're backing it up, verse 11. After 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship with the figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. We put in at Syracuse and stayed there 3 days. From there, we set sail and arrived at Rhegium. The next day, the south wind came up, and on the following day, we reached Puteoli. There we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them, and so we came to Rome. The brothers and sisters there had heard we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. 3 days later, he called together the local Jewish leaders. When they had assembled, Paul said to them, "My brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me because I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. The Jews objected, so I was compelled to make an appeal to Caesar. I certainly did not intend to bring any charge against my own people. For this reason, I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I am bound with this chain." They replied, "We have not received any letters from Judea concerning you, and none of our people who have come from there has reported or said anything bad about you. But we want to hear what your views are, for we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect." They arranged to meet Paul on a certain day and came in even larger numbers to the place where he was staying. He witnessed to them from morning till evening, explaining about the kingdom of God and from the law of Moses and from the prophets. He tried to persuade them about Jesus. Some were convinced by what he said, but others would not believe. They disagreed among themselves and began to leave after Paul had made this final statement: "The Holy Spirit spoke the truth to your ancestors when he said through Isaiah the prophet, 'Go to this people and say, you will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them.' Therefore, I want you to know that God's salvation has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen." For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so the sea and the snakes have done their worst, but they have been overcome. Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, has finally reached Rome, the capital of the Gentile world, with the good news of Jesus. Now, our passage begins with something that might be familiar to you from when we studied the book of 1 Thessalonians back in May. As Paul drew close to the city of Rome, the Christians there heard that he was coming, and they went out to meet him. If you remember, it was normal back then for a city to send out a welcoming party, a delegation, who would go out and greet the visiting important person, like a king or a city official, whoever. They were coming to visit, the city would send out a delegation to welcome them and then to escort them back into the city. In the case of royalty, a king would be escorted with great fanfare. And this is how Paul describes it in 1 Thessalonians, what we studied together. That's what it will be like when Jesus returns, that King Jesus will be greeted by a delegation of his own people who will meet the Lord along the road, which in this case happens to be the air. And they won't all stay in the air, but will instead be like a welcoming party, joining Jesus and escorting him back to the world, earth, where he will judge the earth and establish his kingdom of justice and peace. Now, in Paul's case, this same thing is playing out, but he isn't royalty. He isn't Jesus. He's a more normal but important person to the early church. And so the Roman church sends people out of the city. They send them actually 2 cities away to meet Paul and then welcome him and escort him back to the city. Verse 15 tells us that this encouraged Paul, which makes sense. He had previously written to the Roman church, our book of Romans. He had previously written to them, but he had been unsure about his reception there. There were a lot of rumors flying around about Paul. He didn't know what had reached Rome, if anything had reached Rome, if everything had reached Rome. He didn't know what had made its way there. But he's immediately given encouragement. The Roman Christians have read his letter. They have been waiting for him with joy, and they stand ready to welcome him. So out of all of his fear, suddenly he's met with a party who loves him, who's welcoming him into the city, who looks ready for his time among them. Now, once in Rome, Paul has a measure of freedom. He's able to rent his own house. He's guarded by a Roman guard, and he's evidently chained, but he's able to speak and meet and talk just as much as ever. So he immediately reaches out to the local Jewish leaders. Now, at this point, you would think he would avoid them, right? Things have not gone well in Jerusalem. But here is where history helps us. Well, he probably first does this because Paul genuinely wants his Jewish brothers and sisters to believe that the Messiah they've been waiting for and hoping for and longing for has come. And he is able to set aside the injustices done to him by the other Jewish leaders in order to tell these Jewish leaders the good news about Jesus. But additionally, we know that the political climate is heating up for the Jews. Based on our knowledge of Roman history and the various points of discrimination against Jews and Christians, Paul has probably arrived in the city around 60 AD. This is about 10-ish years before we see the fall of Jerusalem. This would be also after Emperor Claudius had expelled all the Jews from Rome due to their rioting over, and in the historical records, they don't know how it's spelled, so they misspelled Christos. So there's been riots in Rome among the Jews about this sect, this Christian sect among them. And so they've all been expelled from Rome. But this is also after Emperor Nero came to the throne, and he canceled Emperor Claudius's edict in 54 AD and let the Jews come back to the city. So the Jews in Rome have already been kicked out of Rome once due to arguments over Christianity. And now that they have been allowed back in, Nero has gotten progressively unstable. There's no knowing who he's going to turn against, but the early church seems to sense that they and the Jews are easy targets. Paul doesn't know what reports have already reached the Jews in Rome about him, and he doesn't want to start another series of riots in Rome, if you remember the riots he accidentally set off in Jerusalem. So he doesn't want those riots to start in Rome, especially with an unstable Nero. He doesn't want it for the Jews, and he doesn't want it for the witness of the Christians. So he pulls in the local Jewish leaders in advance and tells them up front, I am one of you. I have been unjustly arrested. My hope is your hope. It is Israel's hope. Fortunately, the local Jewish leaders haven't heard anything about anything going on in Jerusalem. They are surprisingly uninformed and surprisingly unbothered to hear that there's problems. Maybe they have been too stressed moving in and out of Rome in the last few years to keep up with everything going on. But they can't help but to have heard about Christianity. which again, they refer to as a Jewish sect, because it was over this topic that the Jews had been kicked out of Rome however many years prior. And so maybe the original Jewish rioters who were so upset didn't move back into the city, or maybe the ones that rioted at first have mellowed out over the years and being moved around everywhere and are now ready to hear. But whatever it is, this group stands ready now that they've met Paul, an educated Jewish scholar who has become a member of this Christian sect. They are ready to hear more about it. Now, as in previous cities, some of them believe and some do not. Paul quotes to them that passage from Isaiah, which calls out those who refuse to hear or understand and have built up calluses from avoiding the Lord that prevent them from recognizing what God is doing. Of course, the passage Paul quotes doesn't mean that there's no hope. In fact, that original passage promises there eventually will be some who respond, who do hear, a remnant, a seed. And then Paul tells them that God's invitation of salvation has, as promised in the Old Testament, been sent out to the world, to whoever could hear and respond. And then the book ends with Paul living out that invitation in house arrest, welcoming anyone who wants to hear about it to come and hear the good news of Jesus. But we want to know what happens to Paul. It's a strange ending, right? We just heard it. It's a really strange ending to a book. If you go back and read Acts in a sitting or two, instead of spacing it out as we had by verse over weeks, there has been a sense of build-up. And the build-up all the way leads to this. Paul imprisoned, waiting for trial, welcoming for anyone who wants to hear about Jesus to come, fate before Caesar, unknown. You might just imagine lots of people have wondered about why Luke chose to end his book this way. People have even speculated maybe the end got lost over the years. But Luke definitely knows the outcome of the trial before Caesar, right? He's chosen to end his book this way. He knows what is ahead for Paul. He knows probably, based on whenever Acts was written, he might even already know about the fall of Jerusalem. He almost definitely knows about the persecution of Christians that's about to be launched. Yet he has chosen to end the book of Luke this way. Now, we don't canonically, as in nowhere within the New Testament does it tell us what happens to Paul. Early church letters tell us that Paul was martyred. Evidently, sometime after the Great Fire in Rome, that would be 64 AD, but sometime after the fire, but sometime before the end of Emperor Nero's reign in 68 AD. This tracks with the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome, because Nero needed a scapegoat. Now, if you don't remember the Great Fire of Rome from your history classes, this was a huge failure and you could say a huge disaster and seen as a political failure. It was bad. It looked so bad on Nero on his reign, like he had done everything wrong and it was his fault. A failure on his part to prevent and a failure to respond quickly. The fire burned through Rome for 6 days before being brought under control, and then the fire reignited and burned for another 3 days. In the end, nearly 3/4 of Rome was destroyed. Razed to the ground. A big, big fire, a big deal. Nero needed to shift the blame falling on him, and so he picked Christians, a relatively young group without a lot of powerful political backing. Roman historian Tacitus described the persecution against the Christians this way. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination, as in they made torches out of the Christians, when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Okay, so that's a direct quote from a Roman historian about the persecution that broke out amongst the Christians, the way that Nero shifted the blame for the fire to this young group that had sprung up. Now, church history lands both Peter and Paul as part of those who were martyred during this time, as part of this after after the burning of Rome and before Nero finally topples from the throne. So Peter, ancient letters tell us, again, we don't know for sure, it's not canonical, it's not in scripture. Ancient letters tell us that Peter was part of those crucified and Paul was part of those beheaded. But why doesn't Luke tell us? It doesn't make the book any less powerful, right? He already records other martyrs like Stephen and James in the early church. And the early church in no way felt like martyrdom was failure. Like in our culture, we might see it as like, guess you weren't so powerful after all, right? But the early church had that mission, that vision of Jesus right before them. They didn't see dying for your faith or being killed unjustly as a sign of failure. In fact, in our earliest church letters, martyrdom is lifted up as one of the best ways to die. To die like Jesus was counted an honor. There's entire letters, and if you want to read them, we can read them together. Entire letters that almost tell people, like, if you can find a way to be martyred, you want to do this, right? So this was lifted up as one of the highest honors. So for Luke, to end the book with martyrdom would not have been seen as a sign of failure. In fact, he could have avoided it because it might have seemed like he was drawing too many similarities between Paul and Jesus. But he doesn't end it. He doesn't tell us. He leaves it open-ended. And Luke's move was intentional. And we can only assume because the point about the book of Acts was never about Paul. The call had been to go out unto the ends of the earth. And here, at the gates of the end of the earth, the apostle to the Gentiles was arriving at the Gentile capital. And so Luke leaves the story open, almost like a to be continued. Luke's first part of the story, the Gospel of Luke, had been about what Jesus, it says in Luke chapter 1, you heard that, or Acts chapter 1, you heard that last week, was about what Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven. Luke then continues on through the book of Acts with Jesus sending the Spirit and the church being called to carry on the story until Jesus returns. And so Luke's story ends, the very earliest church story ends, but its end marks our beginning, the age of now, the time between Jesus and the very earliest church and the time of Jesus' return. And no difficulty or persecution or death silences the story. Again, Stephen, James, Paul, Peter, the first readers of Acts who would have known all about Nero's cruelty, who would have then known about the fall of Jerusalem, none of them were silenced. Instead, the church continued to grow. It continued the movement of Acts. It kept growing and spreading and speaking all through until the ends of the earth, speaking through word and deed, unstopped by the powers of this world. Acts ends in an open-ended way, with the door still open for work and witness, because the Spirit is still active. The Spirit is still at work. The Spirit is still within us. There is work for us to do. We are the continuation of the book of Acts. And our hope, as always, just like for them, isn't in princes and principalities or Neros or anything like that. Our hope is in the God who is on the throne, the God who goes with us and empowers us to speak, who is our hope and our future.
Today's broadcast is a production of Middle Settlements Methodist Church and is copyright 2026, all rights reserved. All music performed during this live broadcast is used with permission pursuant to Christian Copyright Licensing International License number 3386562.